Hey everyone, welcome to a special championship themed locker room talk. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
All right, Joe, in light of Georgia finally getting the monkey off their back, lifting the curse, slaying the goat, however you want to put it, winning their national championship, I thought it'd be a great idea for us to do a locker room talk where we look at the best Georgia teams since their last national championship in 1980 to not win it, and then the best Bama teams during the Saban area to not win it. And we're doing our top three for each. And of course, our locker room talk is brought to you by our fine sponsor, Beach Ball Properties, ran by our friends Hunter and Ginger Harrelson. I'm sure Hunter is smarting a little bit right now. He's about the biggest Bama fan on the face of the planet. We've had him on the show a lot. I'm sure he was quite confident going into that game. I respectfully did not call him during this one, but I will call him this week and find out what's going on. But you know who else should call Hunter Harrelson? That's y'all. Any of the listeners should call him if you're looking for a great beach house opportunity. It's a little cold right now, but it is still gorgeous down in Orange Beach and Gulf Shores. So if you want to go have a ball at the beach, give Hunter and Ginger a call at Beach Ball Properties.
Sounds good.
All right, Joe, let's start with Georgia. Georgia's had quite the run of it since 1980 to 2021 without winning a national championship, of course, which was absolved by the most unlikely of heroes in the mail boy and Stetson Bennett. Of course, great win last night, but Georgia's had some teams that arguably you could say were better than last night's team, at least when it comes to looking at the team as a whole. Offensively, of course, there's definitely been better teams. Now, defensively, that Georgia team last night is going to blow any of these ones we mentioned out of the water. But when you want to look at the teams as a whole, Georgia's had some pretty solid ones. And Joe, my number one pick probably is going to surprise a lot of people because I'm not going with the 2017 team that lost on the second in 2016 to 2M Bama. I'm actually looking at kind of the middle of the Mark Richt era. I think the 2007 Georgia team was just absolutely loaded with talent. 2007 was a crazy year in college football. That was the year that LSU became the only two-loss team to ever win the national championship. Required a lot of things to happen. Of course, it required West Virginia and Pat White to lose a game to Pittsburgh, where I don't even think Pittsburgh was ranked at the end. LSU, of course, lost overtime games to Kentucky and Arkansas that year, yet they won the national championship. Meanwhile, this Georgia team, they lost two games, didn't make the SEC championship, and they finished just outside the top two. I think they were at number 3 and didn't get to get into the BCS championship. And it was kind of funny because I remember this Georgia team that had Noshawn Marino at running back, excellent running back that went on to have a good career with the Broncos. And of course, Matt Stafford, who recently caused Joe and I a lot of heartache with how terrible he played in the last couple of quarters of that Rams game, who of course is going to be, a surefire Hall of Famer, I think, in the NFL. He was the quarterback for this Georgia team. Mohamed Massaquoi was the receiver for him, also a really excellent pro. And this Georgia team, I remember they were so mad they weren't in the national championship game that they played Hawaii that year in the Sugar Bowl. This Hawaii team was undefeated. I think that was the year that Colt Brennan had set all of the passing records single season at Hawaii. And the first play of the game, I think Georgia was returning a kickoff, and a Hawaii guy did what definitely nowadays would have been a targeting and lit this guy up and knocked him out of the game. And he was jumping around and dancing, and as was their whole team. And let's just say that was the last time they danced that entire game. And I think Georgia beat them something like 51-7. But Joe, I think anybody that watched the entire season and watched that game knew that Georgia team was the best team in the country. And they never played LSU. There was never a cross matchup there, so they didn't get the chance to beat LSU and show them they were number one. And I really feel like there's a lot of unfortunate tales in Georgia fan history in that years between 1980 and 2021. But in my eyes, that 2017 was the best Georgia team to not win it.
Yeah, I remember that team very vividly because I followed Hawaii very closely that year. I watched just about all of Colt Brennan's games. I was a huge Colt Brennan fan. I was pulling for Hawaii so bad in that game on New Year's Day back in 2008 in Georgia. I mean, they just came in there and just so dominantly thrashed Hawaii, like no question about it. And I remember after the game, so many people were wondering, should we have put them in the BCS national championship game in lieu of Ohio State after, LSU kind of, beat them. And that Ohio State team was kind of subpar. Like that was, I think Todd Beckham was the quarterback of that team.
Yeah, that was a very unmemorable Ohio State team.
So, yes, I definitely buy into the prestige of that 2007 Georgia team.
All right, Joe, who would you have as your number one Georgia team to have not won the championship?
Number one, I think that was probably the most talent-laden team. I think I would go with them as number one. I do think later on I'll probably have one team in there that I think we may differ on, but I think they are number one as far as talent.
All right, Joe, moving on to number two, I'm actually staying within the Mark Richt era again. I think, a lot of Georgia fans are now they're high on the energy that Kirby Smart has brought to this program. They're so happy they ultimately made the decision to move on from Mark Richt and go to Kirby Smart. But really, it needs to not get lost on America that Mark Richt was a great football coach, and he really did have Georgia as a strength for a long period of time. My number two team is the 2012 team. This team actually also got its heart broken by Alabama in the SEC championship game. And at that point in time, they didn't have a 4-team playoff, or else Georgia would have assuredly gotten in there and probably had a second chance at Alabama. And this game, just really awesome game where both defenses were just brutal. Georgia's quarterback was Aaron Murray. They had A.J. Green as a wide receiver, who A.J. is still doing excellent things in the NFL, really been a very solid, consistent receiver at the NFL. And they also had a lot of really good defensive players that you still see to this day. I think Thomas Davis, the linebacker, was on that team, a lot of other ones. And they played a game against Alabama that was just epic. And Georgia has the ball at the very end to win it, and a lot of time. And they get inside the 10-yard line, and with 15 seconds left, Aaron Murray throws a pass that gets blocked by one of the great Bama defensive linemen up into the air. And instead of letting the ball hit the ground where they would have had 2, possibly 3 plays left, Georgia receiver Chris Conley, who also had a good NFL career, catches the ball and gets tackled inbounds, and the clock runs out, and Georgia misses out on their chance to win. And Joe, that year, Alabama ended up playing Notre Dame for the national championship and just wiping the floor with them. And they definitely, if the Dogs had had a chance, the Fighting Irish that year, they would have had a very similar result as Alabama. And so I know that's a very particularly painful one for Georgia, because if they could have just beaten Alabama, they definitely would have been the champions that season.
Yeah, it's always harder when you're a dominant team and then you lose to like a really good team, like in a semifinal type scenario. And then that you would have wiped the floor with whoever you were going to play in the next round. Like those losses are always tougher. Yeah, I would put that team up there. I think they're going to be my number 3, but my number 2 is that 2017 Georgia team. And here's the reason for that. How close they got, we can talk about a lot of the teams that had so much NFL talent, but I still think that team had a lot. And the story, is still not completely written on that team as far as their NFL prowess. I think about, Roquan Smith at linebacker and some of the other great players. But just to come so close, on the 2nd and 26, looked like they had that game, won the SEC that year. I feel like I've got to put them at number 2.
Joe, I wouldn't blame you on that. Really solid team. The last thing I wanted to throw in for my 2012 team is they also had Todd Gurley as a freshman on that team. And Todd Gurley in that game against Alabama as a freshman against one of the most stellar Saban defenses had like 130 yards rushing. And that was when I was like, man, this guy's going to be good. And of course, he also has had a great NFL career. Joe, I actually left the 2017 team off my list. They do have a lot of talent. Roquan Smith, excellent linebacker. You look at their running backs, their 2-headed attack of Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, who both are doing great jobs in the NFL right now, and who really were the main parts of the attack that Georgia had. They didn't quite have the skill at wide receiver that we saw at some of these other teams that I talked about. I guess probably the best wide receiver they would have had would have been Riley Ridley, I think, on that team, which was Calvin Ridley's little brother. But that Georgia team definitely was more of a defensive laden team and focused on the running backs. And I would have them just out of my top three. And I know a lot of people think that's crazy because we think about the recency thing. But the team that I'm going to put at number three is going way back. And it's pretty much at the very beginning of the Mark Richt era. And I saw this team in person beat my Auburn Tigers in a game where Auburn played way over their head, shouldn't have even been in that game with them, but then had the game absolutely robbed from them on one of the most incredible plays I've ever seen. The 2003 Georgia team is the one I'm referring to. This 2003 team had David Green at quarterback, one of the great journeyman quarterbacks in the history of the SEC, was the starting quarterback at Georgia for 4 years, really excellent. This Georgia team only lost one game. They actually did win the SEC championship, and for some reason they didn't make the BCS championship because that was the year that it was split between LSU and USC, and Georgia just didn't get the nod. You didn't have a 4-team playoff. But I remember Georgia had a receiver to beat Auburn where the quarterback threw it. The Auburn guy was in perfect position to intercept it, and the Georgia guy actually reached over the Auburn guy, lifted it up, and was about at the Auburn guy's gut, pulled it over his head, toe tapped, got the touchdown. And it was right in front of me. And I remember it was like one of the most upsetting Auburn games I've ever seen. But that Georgia team was just, they had players like that. And that was the one that I always thought about in my mind up until some of these other ones would have been the hardest if I had been a Georgia fan, and they ended up not getting the championship that year.
Didn't they have David Pollock on the team too?
David Pollock would have been on that team. Yes, he would have been. One of his 3 times he was a first-team All-American. David Pollock was one of the greatest college football players I've ever seen. I guess he wasn't big enough to make it in the pros because he never did much, but in college, he was just excellent.
He was a first-round pick, I think, by the Bengals in 2005. I think he got hurt, though, like his second year.
Well, that would make sense then because at Georgia, he was hell on wheels. And, yes, he was the captain of that defense, and he made everyone else's life a living hell when they played him.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a good pick. I would put them definitely close to that stratosphere. But I'm going to go third with the 2012 team, really for all the reasons you stated earlier. That team was so close as well.
Right. So, like I said, in retrospect, I think that people, need to, I know Mark Richt is a very beloved person, not just for his coaching prowess, but who he was as a person. But, no matter how many championships Kirby wins, I hope the Georgia fans don't overlook what Mark Richt did, because I just named 3 teams right there that he had that had great chances to win national championships. And at least 1 or 2 of them probably should have.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, so let's move on. Let's go to the other side of the aisle. Saban and Bama smarting from an injury the other night, that they lost this game. But it's not the only time they've lost championships, or they've had teams that probably were worthy of championships that didn't win one. Let's look at who we think Saban's top 3 teams are at Bama that didn't get the ring. And Joe, my number one is probably also going to be a shocking one for people, because this is a Saban team that didn't make an SEC championship, that didn't even make a New Year's Six bowl game. I'm referring to the 2010 team. This 2010 team was fresh off Saban's first national championship in 2009, and of course, 2010 is the year that Auburn won the national championship with Cam Newton. But Joe, this Bama team, just the talent on it was unreal. So, probably their least talented player was their quarterback, Greg McElroy. It was a good college quarterback, but not someone that you're going to go, over the moon with how talented he was. But let's look everywhere else. You had Julio Jones on that team, Mark Ingram, Trent Richardson, Eddie Lacy was on that team. You want to go into the receivers, they, not even outside of Julio, they had a lot of talent. But then you go to the defensive side of the ball, and you had I'm trying to think of the linebackers that they had. They had Mosley. CJ Mosley was linebacker. Dre Kirkpatrick at safety was on that team. Also, they had Dante Hightower at linebacker, who's just been excellent. You also had D. Milliner, who was a really good player for the Jets for a long time at cornerback. And Joe, this defense, I feel like pretty much every single player they had on this defense ended up being an NFL starter. Oh, not to mention the kid from St. Paul's that was Mark Barron was also a safety on this team. I mean, it was just the talent on this team was unreal, and they lost 3 games. Of course, they lost to Auburn in that game where they got up 24-0, and Auburn had the comeback to win 28-27. They also lost the Stephen Garcia game against South Carolina, where Stephen Garcia played the game of his life, kind of like what Zach Calzada did this year for A&M, to come in and beat Alabama at the rowdy Gamecock Stadium. And then LSU beat Alabama on a fake punt by Les Miles that was executed to perfection. And this Alabama team ended up losing 3 games. And it was so funny because I mentioned how Georgia unleashed the frustration of not getting the national championship in 2007 by beating up on Hawaii. Well, this Bama team that lost 3 games with an NFL roster essentially played Michigan State. And Joe, I think they injured 4 Michigan State quarterbacks in that game because they were just so angry and obliterating Nick Saban's old Sparty.
Yeah, I think that was Kirk Cousins on that Michigan State team. He was probably like a junior that year. Yeah, it was like 45-7. It was just an unbelievable just domination.
It was ugly. It was one of the more upsetting games I've ever seen. Not because I really cared about it, but just I felt bad for Michigan State players. Like they were just getting destroyed by like Bama's behemoths on the other side in that game.
Oh, no doubt. No, I'm with you. I actually think that is the most talented team that did not win. I mean, you could argue that team's more talented than Alabama teams that won, obviously. And yeah, I think about like the 3 games that they lost, like so close, and that it's weird that they went 5-3 with all that talent in the SEC.
Oh, it is. I mean, well, one of the things that Saban's talked about over and over again is entitlement and complacency. And he pointed to that team as his ultimate example of entitlement and complacency because they had all the talent in the world, but they had won their first championship and they thought it was owed to them the next year. And they didn't work for it the way they should have. And because of it, they got beat by 3 teams that were more motivated when they played them.
Yeah, that's true.
Including my Tigers, who won the national championship that year. All right. So who do you have? You also have the 2010 team as your number 1. Let's move on to number 2. Now, Joe, my number 2 Bama team that I had was actually the 2016 team. 2016, of course, that Alabama team was undefeated all season. Clemson was undefeated all season. And, of course, the year before, Clemson and Alabama had played an epic game where Alabama had beaten Clemson in the national championship. But Saban, being so concerned about Deshaun Watson and his ability to affect games, he knew that his defense couldn't stop them. Had done probably the first brilliant move I thought I've ever seen Saban do in a championship, where he did the onside kick because he knew he couldn't stop Clemson. So Bama ended up winning that game. The next year, Alabama team that has, I think Derrick Henry had just left, but they still had a lot of talent at the running back position. I think they had, I'm trying to think who the quarterback would have been. It wouldn't have been
Jalen Hurts.
It would have been Jalen Hurts, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This would have been Jalen Hurts as a freshman. So probably the weakest part that Alabama had was, of course, their quarterback. But there were so many things going on outside. I mean, that was when Lane Kiffin had taken the job at FAU. Apparently he had made Saban really mad by missing a bus to go actually to the semifinal game where they were taking on Washington with Jake Browning and Chris Peterson. And Saban actually fired Lane Kiffin at the end of that game. Not really fired him. I guess he knew they're taking their job, but he said, why don't you go ahead and leave early? We'll take it over from here. And he had Steve Sarkisian pull in. And Alabama's defense was excellent. And Clemson just had the ball for so long in that game. And at the very end, this really talented Alabama defense just got tired. I mean, I think something like Clemson had over 90 plays in that game. And, of course, the game ended with the last drive. And on the very last play of the game, Clemson runs the pick play or the rub route, however you want to put it. You can call it a pick play if you're a Bama fan or a rub route if you're a Clemson fan. And Hunter Renfrow makes his touchdown catch to probably be the Stetson Bennett before there was a Stetson Bennett.
Mm-hmm. No, he really was. Great story there. And the weird thing about that team, like as immensely talented as they were on both sides of the football, we often, including myself, characterize Jalen Hurts as kind of the missing link on the team as a freshman. But here's the crazy thing. I want to say he actually won SEC Offensive Player of the Year that season, through it all. So that's the crazy part about it. But then you add in kind of what you were talking about. Alabama still played good in that game, played great all season. They're very dominant. But it really was Deshaun Watson, too, just kind of single-handedly. I feel like he and Mike Williams just were so good down the stretch to kind of will Clemson to the victory.
Yeah, Mike Williams, I remember just being blown away by what he was doing in that game. And Deshaun Watson was having to just throw dimes to Mike Williams and Hunter Renfrow against what was a really good Alabama secondary. I think they would have had Minkah Fitzpatrick on that team. It's hard like for me to like think about some of the other guys they have. I know Minkah Fitzpatrick definitely would have been on that team, and just a lot of other really solid players. And it really was just a great game plan and three great players for Clemson that got it done, that being Watson, Renfrow, and then, of course, Mike Williams.
Was Bo Scarborough the running back? I was trying to remember who it was.
Yeah, it would have been Bo Scarborough in that game.
Okay.
And, and Clemson had a good running back too. Wayne Gallman actually had a pretty good game in that one. And I think Wayne Gallman was a senior at that point and had a good Clemson career and finished in a pretty solid showing in that game.
Yeah, you forget about him too because of ETN's success.
That's right. And Joe, that was definitely one where, we talked about Jalen Hurts' limitations at that point. What's interesting is he hadn't had a great game, but he actually did get a touchdown with, I think, 3 minutes left, a rushing touchdown that was like 25 yards, put Alabama ahead. So he showed that he still had the moxie right there to get Alabama up when he wasn't playing that good with a new offensive coordinator. It was just that Deshaun Watson was just a little bit more clutch.
Yeah, I remember that play for Alabama, and also the O.J. Howard touchdown was pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that would be my number two. And then, Joe, who would be your number two Alabama team to not win it?
It's really that team. I mean, I really am in complete agreement, I think, with you for the most part with these Alabama selections. But, yeah, I was thinking about when you were going through the players that played for these teams. It's so hard because every year they have so many NFL draft prospects. They kind of just run together.
Yeah, I mean, it really has gotten to that point. I feel like in the beginning of Saban being there, I could kind of identify which players which played for which teams. But now, I mean, he's been so good and so prolific that it's hard to identify which players were with which era.
Absolutely.
All right, Joe, the last one that I have, and I got to see this team in person, and they were excellent. This was the Kick 6 team, 2013. You had A.J. McCarron return as the starting quarterback. And, Joe, I got to say that he was really the first prolific passer of the Saban era. He wasn't he didn't have what you're seeing right now with what Tua did or Mac Jones or what you saw with Bryce Young this year. But he did have quite a good season. Then you had Amari Cooper, and Amari Cooper was just excellent that season. At running back, they had TJ Yeldon. And then on defense, per the usual, a lot of really good star power. And I remember I was at the Kick 6 game, and I saw Amari Cooper get like 199 yards against Auburn, including 2 plays of over like 98 yard. He had 2 like 98-yard touchdowns against Auburn. It was nuts. And I mean, Auburn had to do everything in the world, like in the Kick 6 game, to win. I mean, just an excellent football game. And that was they were going for back-to-back championships at that point. And they would have been, I think, at that point, been 3 out of 4 national championships. They won in 2009. Actually, they won in 2012. That's why they were trying to three-peat, because they won in 2011, 2012, and they were going for the three-peat in 2013. And Auburn, of course, won that game. Stopped them in the Kick 6, and then Auburn ended up playing the championship and losing to Florida State. But that Bama team was absolutely loaded as well. And definitely looking back at it, I thought the 2014 Bama team that did make the college football playoff nowhere near as talented as the 2013 team that didn't.
Yeah, the 2014 team, they're kind of like similar to the 2021, kind of like, very overachieving team compared to others. But yeah, I'm with you, I think, as well. on the third place being the 2013 team. I almost went with the 2018 team I was talking to you about before the show because of the regular season dominance of the 2018 team with Tua. They just flew through the regular season. I think about them winning in Baton Rouge by I think 29 points. I mean, it's just crazy. But at the same time, I feel like that loss to Clemson, 42-14, you just can't get away from that. It's just such an embarrassing loss. You didn't see that with the 2013 team. They were eliminated in the kick six. I know they lost to Trevor Knight in Oklahoma in the Sugar Bowl, but let's face it, I don't think they cared that much by that point. And so I'm going to say, when it mattered most, it took, one of the best plays in college football history to beat them.
That's right. I mean, it took a play like the kick six, and then so many others in that game. The Sammy Coates touchdown on the run read option by Nick Marshall. Nick Marshall's long touchdown run. You got a Carl Lawson's fourth down stop of T.J. Yeldon. I mean, that really was that's the greatest college football game I've ever seen, and that's the effort that it took from Auburn to win that game. In addition to a lot of missed field goals by Alabama.
That's right.
All right, Joe. With that being said, great locker room talk here. I mean, you could talk for hours about all the great Nick Saban teams, but these are the three best teams from Georgia and Alabama. Georgia since 1980, Alabama since the Saban era to not win the championship. And thanks everybody for listening. We'll be back for a couple of more segments. You want to check out all of our old podcasts, they're on Spotify. You can also, follow our new YouTube page, the Dan Joe Sports Show on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter at DJ Sports Show. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.